Yeah, so good afternoon once again. I'm glad to see you again, and welcome to the sixth meeting of our online Scientiae seminar series called History of Scholarship and the Global Imagination. As you all know, we are coordinating with Stefano Gulizia this seminar in cooperation with the Institute of Philosophy, Czech Academy of Sciences. And one week, Stefano is chairing from Turin. The other week, I am chairing from Prague. Um, Today's speaker, as you know, is Stefano himself. Stefano, there is no need to introduce him. Most of you know him very well. He is a historian of early modern science and philosophy, and also intellectual historian with special interest in intellectual communication and how Stefano calls it coordination, intellectual coordination. He was trained as a classicist and philologist. Afterwards, he taught at several universities in the United States, and he held fellowships in California, Oxford, Chicago, Montreal, Berlin, Wolfenbüttel, Bucharest, and Warsaw before returning back to Italy and becoming a member of the Faculty of History at the University of Milan. I should mention some of the themes Stefano deals with, especially Aristotelian natural philosophy, the relation between science or knowledge and print culture. He's interested in topics related to cosmology and textual scholarship. And in 2020, he edited a special issue on the fascinating topic mechanical automata in early modern Europe. Um, Stefano is also currently the editor-in-chief of the Scientiae Studies series at the Amsterdam University Press. And as you all know, since 2023, he is president of Scientiae, of the Society Scientiae. And I must say he is a spiritus agens and spiritus movens of most of the activities associated with this society and our community, our broader community. Stephanos' today's talk will deal with the world chronologies from China to Scandinavia, and especially with two figures and two works, Christoph Helwig's Theatrum Historicum et Chronologicum, and Thomas Bangius's Caelum Orientis. And of course, we are all very much looking forward to your lecture, Stefano. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this long, unnecessary presentation. I love the fact that we are in a sort of intimate setting because this is very experimental. And I hope that it will be as entertaining, at least partially entertaining to you as it has been for me to sort of put together this strange choreography. I will try to speak mostly, I mean, for reasons of space, I will speak mostly about Christoph Helwig, who is perhaps better known of the two because in part because he's a precursor of John Locke, among other things. And there are several studies recently appeared on him, also by a very prestigious one by Christoph Luthi, for instance, and others. Bangius is and remains a pretty mysterious figure. He's an Orientalist from Denmark, and my main interest about him is because he's a Kierkegaardian figure, as we will get to see later in the talk. However, I want to begin with the first claim, a research claim, which is really I tend to see chronology rather than as a genre, epistemic genre, if you want to use the Janapamata sentence, or just a discipline of knowledge, I tend to see chronology rather as a technology that allows the binding and crossing of different fields, including certainly natural history, natural philosophy, but also ethics, law, and politics. And so to understand or to appreciate this sort of connection, I think I thought to follow today one metaphor of knowledge, which is that of chronology as the eye of history. Where does it originate? And my question is also will be, as you can see in a moment, if chronology is the eye of history, what do we see, and who does the seeing? So we begin with the formulation that most of you are familiar with, which is Abraham Ortelius from the 1570 edition of the Theatrum, where you see from the prefatory letter, about 4 or 5 lines from the top, you see the quotation that geography, not chronology, geography, according to some, is the eye of history. Historiae oculus appellata est. Now, from this sort of codification in cartographic imagination, the quotation, Ortelius takes this knowledge from elsewhere, he says, and we can take him at face value because indeed there is a codification of this knowledge, for example, in the post-Melanchthonian tradition of historiography epitomized by David Chytræus here, who produced also Chronology of Herodotus and Thucydides, which was printed many, many times. It was a success in the Holy Roman Empire and in Northern Europe. And as you can see, according to Chytræus, you have this idea that to understand the order of history, you can either place yourself as if you were looking at a table, velut in tabula pictum, maybe not a table but a painting, it's historiography as painting, or putting yourself in a sort of stratosphere from a point of view so high above that allows you to have a synoptic view. Velut in excelsa specula collocati, oculis nostri. So there is this validation of autopsy from a point of view that is very high above. Now, this formulation by Ortelius has been taken up by many authors in the Baroque period. I just wanted to mention Agrippa d'Aubigné, who in the world history refers to a sort of strange conception of the book, in which you see every book ends with a war or with a peace treaty. The two things are equivalent to him. And the purpose of the book for him is to lie together the affairs of France with the neighbors, and to by doing so to visit all the corners of the world. So there is this sort of journey that Aubigné wants to take with us, and the journey is organized across columnar devices. So there is this emphasis on keeping in your hand, as you see in the quotation, a complete history of the North in good format, in good shape. And if you possess the mind, the spirit, able to make distinctions, to operate with the sort of the Ciceronian art of memory, if you will, then you can reduce the order of all the things that are disordered. So this is a sort of a Baroque genealogy of the Ortelian metaphor. There is an alternative one, which is really about how to think about pandemics as a model of the diffusion of knowledge. So you have Fracastoro on the one hand, who gives us exactly this idea, how the propagation of an illness gives us a model to think about empire. And in the other example, you see a sort of strange treatise that wants us to believe that the devils are moving from the Americas back into Europe, and namely in the Basque country. So you have a sort of Fracastoro's theory on the back, the theory of epidemiology of a global pandemic that becomes a translatio imperi. And then finally, and this is to conclude my first section today, is we see the metaphor of the eye of history now fully fledged in a chronological sense by Alsted. And I can say more to this in a discussion because this page has been imitated by an important Jesuit who operated in China. So I'm very happy to go there. But at the moment, I just want to mention that in this prefatory letter, Alsted reprises the Ortelian metaphor, and he says this time, the historia dico cuius anima est veritas lux et oculus chronologia. So the eye and the light of history is chronology. So this is sort of the ending point of a tradition, which then takes us to the next stage of today's lecture, which is about the readability of the past. As I said before, if chronology is a window, is eye of history, then what do we see, and do we see primarily through the production of textbooks or the use of textbooks? So I'm going to give you a very brief sort of overview of both angles. The first one takes us into Helwig production, so we'll say a bit more about him later. But for now, I just wanted to mention 2 points of relevance. One is that the book of Chronologia Universalis, which you can see here in the 1618 edition, wants to be understood as something constructed simultaneously through ekphrastic means and also as a synoptic view. So you see this quotation underlined, per epitomen et synopsin. So you have zooming in and zooming out sort of coaxial in this structure. And the book is committed to a person who wants to be an intrepid explorer, qui vasto historiarum pelago se committere velit. But the reality is that this book is read primarily by armchair travelers, and maybe not everyone is affected by ennui as this particular student. But in fact, we can think that the primary reader of a book like Helwig would have done something like this. This is an example of historia literaria, if you will. It's just a patchwork of quotations and things that allow you to make the journey. And so to understand how chronology as a Renaissance art or genre is put together, we have to step back into this sort of pre-printed scribal production, which then, of which I give you another example. This is a prestigious example that comes from a sinologist, sinologist in England, Edward Bernard, who also possessed a famous map of China. And you see here a manuscript in the miscellaneous collection of the Bodleian Library, where the second column from the right has informations about Chinese emperors, or as he calls them, reges, kings. So there is this sort of adaptation, and he uses a manuscript, as you can see, pretty much like a printed surface, there is a sort of combination of the two medium pretty clearly. This explains why the choice made by Helwig and his printing entourage to come up with this is taken from the major textbook of chronology by Christoph Helwig, is very much a sort of Kafkian, agoraphobic almost world. So it's all based on, there is no blank space. Blank space in chronology has a very important function because readers could correct, could update information, use it as an encyclopedic means. But as you can see, there is a sort of manifestation of the theory of the four monarchies, which comes from Melanchthonian, background. And then you have a Christology in the center of the page, which is underlined emphatically by a certain use of font. And so it's the mise en page that does that for Helwig. Now, this is remarkable, especially because most readers, if I come back for a slide, would have expected the printed edition to be somewhat like this. And in fact, many chronologies of the time would have appeared exactly like that instead of this particular page. Now, from the points, again, we are here considering a bit of the production of these books. In this part of the Chronologia Universali, Helwig refers to the book of Daniel, which is a major point of reference in the synchronization of time, and also to Polybius. And he says in a quote in the italics that you can see, that his preoccupation is to combine together particular histories, there is to say local history with the universal history. So, conferre posse ad universi notitiam particularem historiam. And the way to do this, I'll give you just one example that brings us back to the sort of tools of chronology. This is an example taken by Isaac Vossius, who publishes a book that also deals with the ancient chronology of China, De Veritate Mundi. And essentially, without reading the slide, the point is that Vossius reprises an earlier description taken from the chorography of Pomponius Mela. Now, the chorography of Pomponius Mela, which in turn will be also imitated by Pliny in the Naturalis Historia, concerns not the Chinese, but the Scythian. So it's essentially a pastoral utopia, if you will, a description of a land that gives a bountiful results without stress, without war, where people live happily, and there's sort of the body politics is happily self-enclosed. So one way in which the Polybian sense of putting together local and universal history is exactly this, basically grafting a piece, like in this case, that belongs to the ancient discourse of pastoral utopianism, and grafting it into from the Scythia of this, the fourth book of Herodotus, for example, grafting it all the way into China. And Vossius at this time was operating as a castigator. He was the author of a series of castigaciones and observaciones on the text of Pomponius Mela, as well as Pliny, in the 1650s, in the in the larger orbit of the Orientalism promoted by Queen Christina, and in fact also reacting to the first books of description of China in a chorographic way, which were printed in the Low Countries by Martino Martini. Now, very briefly, I just want to take another look, this time the point of view of the readers. What did the readers do to the textbooks of Helwig? This is just a few of many examples that could have been made. This example is from the Hub in Wolfenbüttel by a reader that I came to know quite well, which is Granius, the Swedish polymath. And you can see that he sort of underlines meticulously, and he makes calculations at the bottom of the page. This is somewhat typical. You find also a copy of Peter Lambeck, who was the librarian in Vienna at the imperial court, that sort of uses the framework that you can see to make further calculation also across the book. And in the ending flyleaf that you see on my right, he quite correctly, he attributes Helwig, to Helwig, he attributes the knowledge of a methodus, he says, Scaligerianus. So he says the Helwig is a follower of Scaliger, which is true. So Helwig is a promoter of the sort of particular contraption that has to do particularly with the ancient history of Egypt, and you can see that in the book. Now, still, this is still a copy owned by Peter Lambeck, and in this case, in this page, he mentions the figure of Samuel Bochart, who is very incredibly important to me for my current research on China. And so I wanted to end this section with a quotation by him, which is of paramount importance, because the idea is that, according to Bochart, things ring true the first time, and then eventually they become a distortion the second time around. And so this is an idea that is taken by probably from Tertullian, from late antique sources, but it became pivotal not only because of the construction of sacred bibliography, I mean, of sacred biblical scholarship and the idea of sacred geography, but also for chronology. And so the idea is that many chronologists became essentially etymologists, and they collected, for example, names. And all the names bring back for this idea that paganism, I mean, according to this idea that paganism is a distortion of sacred history, you can essentially retrace by etymological means this sort of narrative and go back to Moses. And this is what you find, for instance, in the book by Pierre Daniel Houet, who is a follower of this method and was in fact a student, a pupil of Bochart, and then it sort of fell apart at a later time. So we can say more about this sort of comparatistic ethnography, but at the moment I wanted to conclude the session like this. And for the next part, we will return to the concept of armchair traveling. And I will give you just, if you can please read the slides with me as I also present you with some music.
Range sur la table, sur le tapis, et toi dans mon lit. Au présent du présent, fraîcheur de la nuit, j'ai de ma vie.
So if I've been successful so far, I have opened a window in which the Ortelian idea of armchair traveling actually is a good, comforting way to discuss Ricci and his activity in China. The genre of armchair traveling has been studied also in relation to painting and theory of art. Particularly this one. This armchair traveling studio. And I wanted to give you just one example, considering by the time Martino Martini was operating in 16, well, he was a witness of the change of dynasty in 1644. Restrictions on traveling had been progressively loosened to the point that we know, for example, of an exchange of astronomical exchanges between Tibet and the court in Beijing, where also the Jesuits and Adam Schall and Martini were operating. Travel, including various purposes, also for the literati, and increasingly the literature travel was associated with landscape imagery. So this was not true only of painting and prints, but also of viewing stones, which were understood as miniature mountains. So I brought just one example, which is not so far away in chronology. So it's taken from a collection now at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, 10 Bamboo Studio Manual of Painting and Calligraphy from 1633. So this is just the end of another sort of journey that takes the metaphor from Ortelius to another dimension. Now, more to continue with my lecture, we're just about halfway through. The next section is about Christoph Helwig from another point of view, that is to say, his reception in Restoration England. And I begin with a book, The Primitive Origination of Mankind of 1677, which was written by England's Lord Chief Justice, Sir Matthew Hale. The book rehearsed arguments from ancient cosmologies and touched upon the chronological debates of his times, including the issue of the estimated ages of the world. According to an interpretation that belongs to Richard Popkin, among others, the view of this book, the goal of this book was to disprove the theory, the pre-Adamite theory of Isaac Lapeyre. And as a most insidious consequence originating from this theory, namely that the natural society without religion could exist. Hale was a prominent jurist and public figure of the Restoration era, as well as a religious writer and a natural philosopher. At his death, he left a personal archive of notebooks and scribal materials of overwhelming complexity, now housed at the Lambeth Palace Library in London, which have continued to puzzle historians. Most of these papers are miscellaneous. Some are dedicated exclusively to God, others to magnetism. To single out discrete topics, also there is a reproduction of a Torricellian experiment. There are, of course, loose and self-standing chronological calculations. When we consider this sort of Nachlass now at Lambeth Palace, it's easy to see chronology as a connected system of communication. And moreover, what lends the sense of unity is less the clarity of the research agenda in Hale's case than the determination to record the archival afterlives of ideas. And moreover, in this research archive, mosaic physics represents a flexible background for inquiry. To be sure, one finds shifting foundations in the case of chronology. In The Dark Abyss of Time, Paolo Rossi pointed out that critics or historians had essentially two available tactics in dealing with the extraordinary length of time. One, sorry, just a moment. One, they could, the first tactic, they could either reduce all human events and traditions to sacred history by stretching, adapting, or perhaps translating calculations between different calendars and date-keeping devices. Or, and the second, they could deny the validity of all pagan sources by denouncing their preposterous nature with a variety of perceived danger. In fact, Matthew Hale seems to employ both of these strategies at once. On the one hand, he plays with visual charts of time, expressing a clear preference for the numeration provided in 1609 by Christoph Helwig. On the other hand, he outlaws the depth of nationalistic accounts as both prideful and perverse. More precisely, Hale thinks that those who credit to the world an immense antiquity commit a theological mistake. So true accommodation, to use the Jesuit term, is the way of leaning on long duration that presupposes a benign presence of God, but at the same time, in doing so, they also make of God a necessity ab extrinsico, as opposed to admitting his power as free and intellectually free. So then comes another session where the ability to trace back many thousands of years is explicitly placed as the object of discussion. And it is here that we find Hale acting in a surprising fashion. First of all, Hale silences Scaliger. So the revolutionary suggestion that the temporal markers of the Hebrew Bible could, and for sure should, be interpreted in tandem with Egyptian, Persian, and Babylonian evidence is not invoked, but only to a limited purposes. Hale also wants to escape the rift between chronologers, which is interestingly also something that Martino Martini writes in the preface of his Scientiae Historiae, printed in Germany in 1658. At this point, Hale admits that the Septuagint chronology, which assigns 2,262 years instead of 1,656 in the Masoretic text, from the creation to the flood, do seem more useful to the solution of some difficulties. Nevertheless, Hale reports the chronological chart prepared by Christoph Helwig, which I showed you in a previous slide. So in his day, Helwig was known correctly so as a Hebraist and also a follower of Scaliger in matters of chronology. We have seen Peter Lambeck saying that writing that in his copy. Two of his printed textbooks, namely the Grammar of Hebrew and indeed the Theatrum Historicum Sive Chronologiae Systema Novum, are also reminiscents of the encyclopedic method of Rudolf Goclenius, and showcase and capitalize a variety of tabular semi-Aramis devices. So by design, Helwig is a proud academic, conscious of his diligence for having equalized intervals of centuries and decades, and especially for rendering their ensuing figure pleasant to the reader and available for consumption at a glance, with a synoptic view that exploits to the fullest the limits and flaws of the printed page. It is only natural that historical actors were encouraged to continue or correct the chronologer's work pen in hand. And on this respect, I gave you some examples just a few minutes ago. Conversely, in Hale's presentation, a lot of these features are lost. There is no trace of Helwig's computational tour de force, and content on the table is drastically reduced. So you no longer have this, what I call the Kafkian sort of horror vacui that I showed before. In fact, Hale praises Helwig's solid system only as an excuse to justify his own omissions, and before inviting the reader to ask, what can be learned, what can we recollect from ancient histories? And this is the quote. In your slide, those nations whose historians put fair for the greatest antiquity are the Romans, Grecians, Persians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Egyptians, and the Jews. Of all these, there is something extant. As touching the Chinese and their long-derived annals, there is much spoken by report or relation, but nothing authentic thereof is extant to the common view, but some ingenious yet uncertain collections out of Martinius by Mr. Webb in his essay touching the primitive language, Vossius, and some others. And therefore, I shall spare anything touching them. Martino Martini is here recognized as the ultimate authority used by John Webb in his 1669 An Historical Essay, implicitly suggesting that the narration of the Ming-Manchu's transition with its basic narrative template of invasion, conquest, and inevitable corruption of the language was adapted to the specific needs of English audiences who were just recovering from a civil war. Hale's trust in Martini as a primary source and in linear descent onto Webb is quite an original intuition for the time, because he could have easily used a multilateral prospect in a variety of cosmographical authors such as Raleigh, Halen, who may be said to have influenced Webb directly. At the same time, Hale's conclusion is typically non-committal. He refuses to go into a more sustained analysis, and perhaps he shows more than a bit of disdain for the sources of knowledge, which, as you can see, are just spoken by report or relation. So Hale is skeptical about the reporting of the Jesuit materials, the reworking by various authors, and he says that what has been concocted out of Martini originated, quote, an ingenious yet uncertain portrayal. As for Vossius, he is mentioned again in relation to the recognizably substantial objection that if a general flood has swept away all governments from the earth, how could such a powerful monarchic system as that boasted by the Syrians or the Babylonians arise in a relative short amount of time? The intractable problem, Hale admits, is greatly alleviated by Vossius' reliance on the Septuagint chronology. And here I go to the second quote. The truth is, we are still strangers to the true state of chronology of the Ceres or Chineses. What we have touching it is by broken relation or some few travelers, and what they had possibly may gather up from the vulgar tradition of that people, upon which little some conclusion can be made touching their antiquity. This statement, which repeats the skepticism of Hale towards travel literature and his conviction that various explanations of cosmopolitan origins, including the so-called Scythian theory, or the Ur language, being something different than Hebrew, amounts to pure conjecture. And this explains why, in the end, Chinese antiquities fare fractionally lower, say, than Egyptian or Assyrian national myths. And especially it explains, in my view, why Hale sees much evidence in this discussion is still provided by the Americas. Now we are approaching the end of this lecture. I have about 4 or 5 minutes left. But if you follow the argument about Thomas Bangius as a kind of follower of Kierkegaard, and the fact that for him, this sort of rabbinic and Kabbalistic models are nothing but a flight of fancy, a sort of Icarus flight, I can show you two last things before concluding my lecture. One is indeed a passage where Bangius cites approvingly Kierkegaard's idea about the Egyptian language, which is taken by the Caelum Orientis, and you can see the underlying part, which is interesting. Well, it's interesting for many reasons, but primarily because Kierkegaard had a reputation as a charlatan. And so it's very interesting to see that in this milieu, at least from Bangius' perspective, he takes, as we saw earlier in the lecture, he takes a different view than Ole Worm concerning the theory of pre-Adamite theory of La Peyrère. But then is a staunch sort of Kierkegaardian as far as the Egyptian hieroglyphs are concerned. And then the second and last example comes from Bangius, is indeed a quotation in the very few small pages, 132 to 34, where Bangius essentially dismisses the theory of pre-Adamite theory, saying that Pereirus, so the La Peyrère, interesting that the name reminds, a kind of a Marrano name. He says that he constructs a spider web out of nothing. No, universum arachne structure molem. So it's something like deflating. Deflating is an attempt to read to construct the pre-Adamite theory out of a small exercise of close reading from the letter of St. Paul to the Romans. Now, concluding my lecture, I just wanted to do one thing and actually give you a conclusion, which very much ties up to the beginning. I wanted to really speak today about the eye of history. And I have two conclusions. One is quite simple. And it has to do with the fact that the Jesuit tradition, which I quoted, it's a subterranean sort of underlying presence throughout the lecture, is really much more complex than the simple accommodatio. We are very used to the idea that the Jesuits, especially in China, because they were, according to their own ideas of construction of comparative anthropology, think of Jose de Acosta, they were in the presence of a civilization that to their eyes were superior. And because of that, they wanted to incorporate elements of Neo-Confucianism, which to the eyes, especially of people of the first generation, like Alessandro Valignano, the procurator, and Ricci, this was conducive to a better understanding of Thomistic theology. So the natural theology of the Chinese was a conduit to a better Aristotelian understanding of the mysteries of the Trinity. However, this view, which, as you know, and I won't get there, it was heavily contested by Dominicans in the field in the same period, also through what is known as the controversy of the rites, is not the only way. In fact, the Jesuits, Kierkegaard, who was somebody who taught Martini at the Collegio Romano before he was sent to China, was also a proponent of Prisca Theologia type of argument, as well as Preparatio Evangelica by Eusebius. And you saw in the second of this brief sort of documentary or silent parts of the lecture, where I mentioned Maimonides. Maimonides actually had a pretty substantial theory of accommodatio, which apparently in northern circles of Scandinavian Orientalists, and I assume, this is just an hypothesis of mine, but I assume that Queen Christina was particularly interested in this, is an alternative view of accommodatio from the one that we know so much because of Ricci, Valignano, etc. So I think in the end, we have to use a little more of the polymathic persona to understand the Jesuit reconstruction of deep antiquity, because I think it liberates historical energies and helps us to understand a bit more of the production and circulation of these textbooks. And then finally, very finally, maybe just the last half minute or so, I wanted to bring back the question of the simultaneous use of what I call ekphrasis and synopsis. So the idea that you simultaneously zoom in and zoom out. Now, there is a very beautiful essay by the art historian Ernst Gombrich, who wrote about this fresco from Pompeii. This is from the Casa del Fauno. and it describes the Battle of Issus of Alexander. And you can see that the battle is a sort of confusing background, but there is a construction of a few characters and a few horses, and even a sort of mise en abîme at the center, which you see better here, which, according to Gombrich, gives a sense of how this is how the spectator gets inside the scene and has a privileged view of the happening. Now, there is no privileged view in the same depiction of the same historical episodes, which by Albrecht Altdorfer, many of you know this from the Alte Pinakothek in Munich. This was, I believe it was 1528, unless it's 1532. But to understand this battle scene, you can only understand it from above. You have to have a sort of what I call a stratosphere. You have to place yourself in the stratosphere. So what is if chronology is the eye of history, what do we see? We see a lot of intermediality across manuscript and printed textbooks, but we also see this kind of combination, as I said before, between ekphrastic means and synoptic means. So we simultaneously zoom in and zoom out. And perhaps it's useful because Christoph Helwig does so to remind ourselves of Polybius, something that he says that is essentially when he defends the role of autoptic vision, he uses the word emphasis, which in Greek is something like emphasis ton pragmaton. So the vividness, there is a register of vividness about the past, which he wants to capture. And the way you capture that is very similar to what I understand of chronologies in the Renaissance, which is essentially this kind of strange conflation. No? As you can see, this beautiful painting by Altdorfer, you see Ottomans dressed up like Germans, like a sort of a Mitteleuropa, getting into the battles of Issus. So there is this simultaneous action of emphasis or ekphrasis, if you prefer, and synopsis. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefano, very much for this, I would say, multi-genre presentation, full of fresh ideas and unexpected connections. And I would like to open the discussion. Your questions, comments, please. You can either start straight away or signal somehow that you would like to speak, but there is no need any formal. I can't see any hand at the moment. If there is,
maybe it was terrifying to follow the various.
No. I may ask the first question if you allow me. So thanks once again for this very rich material, and I would be interested in the connections between Bangius, of whom I know nothing, really nothing, and Helwig. Is there any link, especially in the way they used these chronological charts as a certain epistemic tool, and the sort of second question. Helwig, of course, was as you also reminded us, was a follower of Scaliger in many respects. How Bangius deviated from this tradition? Let's say what was his opinion about Scaliger, and how he proceeded from Scaliger and Helwig to something different. If you can comment on this. Thank you.
Excellent. So as far as I know, there is no direct citation of Helwig by Bangius, especially in the book of 1657. Although for sure he must have known his activity simply because it was printed all over, and so to the extent that he was in touch with circles also beyond Denmark, he must have known that. So in that sense, I'm pretty sure. And what I can say is that the book is very much about Egypt. I mean, Egypt is the primary the primary field against which everything is constructed, and in part that is because of the time. 57 would be after the publication of the Bellum Tartaricum, which is the sort of news of the fall of the Ming Empire. But that book is short, is a different sort of monograph, perhaps a Thucydidean monograph, but it does not contain chronological observations. It was only in 58 and then subsequently, because the Book of Martini were printed in the Netherlands, so 60, 58, 59, 60, you see a lot of Orientalists from the north reacting to that. In the written version of this project, which is actually spread across 2 chapters, there is I speak about somebody in Friesland who actually, you can see a progression from a post-Scaliger sort of moment where the main discussion is Egypt. And then in a few years, you see China gaining momentum. And so the Chaldeans retreat to the background, which is interesting. And I think also, I mean, this is an incidental remark, but the Chaldeans, the Babylonian antiquity is interesting because you have a group of astronomers who essentially, by metonymy, they represent the totality of Babylonian culture, just as much as the Egyptian priests are the preservers of this, sort of sacred annals. So to return to your question, what I see in Bangius is a very mysterious character. Even after this lecture, I don't think there is much more knowledge, available about him. But the book is interesting. It's difficult to penetrate. But what I could see from my experience of it is that every time he reasons about Egypt, he follows John Marsham. So it's oriented towards Scaliger, but it's also accepting the sort of further contraption, let's say, that Marsham was propagating in England. So essentially, so Bangius seems to be a Scaliger follower through other authors who are active in England in this period. And this is in part the reason why I use Matthew Hale. I could have also used Edward Stillingfleet, who is interesting because of the same reason, because Stillingfleet publishes his books on sacred chronology, and he does earlier pointing primarily to the Assyrians, Babylonian annals, and then Egypt, and then later on he also gets into China through the discussion. So that's similar, but nevertheless, Helwig is not a primary source. It's not highlighted, underlined specifically. The main difference is that Helwig is very much a continental sort of a typical traditional, perhaps typical chronologer of the Holy Roman Empire, let's say post Alsted, in the period, he's a product of the 30 Years' War, also in his own career. He's also in touch with Wolfgang Radke, who is a kind of Comenian, reformer of education. On the other hand, Bangius is very much a Hebrew specialist. So his book is written from a perspective of sacred philology, and it has a different format altogether. So it's reminiscent of other works. It reminded me a lot of Louis Capel, for example, and the discussion about whether the Masoretic text with the pointed vowel, whether that's historical or it's the copyist added that. So Bangius is a different kind of writer in that respect, because he's very much a exegetical. I mean, he does Hebrew exegesis in perhaps in the style of Hottinger or as I said, Louis Capel.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, Veronica.
Thank you, Stefano, for this very rich lecture. And I have a question, as you have outlined in a such intriguing way the production of chronological knowledge as a result either of physical traveling or armchair traveling. It made me wonder about involuntary transcultural experience such as captivity. For example, Hassan al-Bazan, one of the most famous captives, Leo Africanus, produced his description of Africa. So I was wondering if in the material that you study now on chronology, if you have examples of this other type of travel, so involuntary travel, such as captivity, perhaps just a marginal question. Thank you.
That's an excellent question indeed, because in fact, I do have materials like that. And then strangely, they come from a later period. So I have encountered Swedish captives in the 18th century who are stationed in Siberia, of all places. And so because they were able to communicate with populations in Mongolia, I mean, in modern Mongolia and so on, they had this knowledge. And they also were in touch with Tibetan lamas. And the Jesuits at that point were trying to explore the last. This is 18th century, so it's no longer the Italians, the one but it's actually French ones, the ones who spoke with Leibniz and etc. So in that generation, and even later, around the foundation of the Academy of St. Petersburg, you have a lot of captives doing the sort of mediation of stories and also national myth and things that are related to the ethnos in a way. And so you see a lot of that. So you have this interesting shift between diplomacy and then this kind of Orientalism, which is then taken on in a framework of Leibnizian theory, because the Academy of St. Petersburg is essentially, in the early years, is staffed by Germans who follow Leibniz. And so it's interesting that Leibniz is one of perhaps the most outspoken person who said, no, Hebrew is not the original language. There must be something else. And he returns to this sort of ghost theory of the Scythian, proto-linguistic theory and so on. So yeah, captives are sort of very intriguing sources. They have a function later on, and I see these materials also taken on by Bayer, if I remember his name, Thomas Bayer, who writes a kind of Museum Sinicum, which is a sort of conflation of various things, ethnography, chronology, and traditions that are mediated by these groups. But also, to end the first part of your question, you mentioned Leo Africanus. Now, that's interesting for another reason, because it allows me to say something about Spain. Now, it's not just what interests me in Bangius, which is absolute ghost, and Helwig is much less of a ghost, but in a way they're two ghostly figures. What interests me is that I'm interested in a cosmopolitan view of Orientalism in the 17th century. So I don't think this is primarily a problem that has to do with what today is Germany versus France or Italy, although there are national styles of doing this, of course, Baronio and so on. But the problem is really more cosmopolitan. And so there are Spanish writers who use the Muslim calculation of the past to essentially write a history of Spain that is connected to the Mediterranean. And so it's a history that looks a lot like Samuel Bauchart. It looks a lot like Phoenician history. So you have Spanish Orientalists like the Marquis de Mondejar, for example, who writes in 1687 Examen Cronológico, which is in the Library of Madrid, the National Library. And the book is essentially doing the same that Vossius and others are doing and I think also Ole Warm with this kind of pre-Adamite theory circulating. They're sort of saying there is something that is annotated before the flood, and essentially it proves that Spain is part of a larger geopolitical construction that is made by the Phoenicians. So and it's essentially part of the sort of Brodelian view of history as a Mediterranean matrix. So I think chronology and Orientalism can be very political. And of course, there is no, there's no denying that by erasing the Muslim past of Al-Andalus, you essentially have a history of Spain, which is entirely Mediterranean and also entirely non-Muslim. So that's the scary part.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your insights.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So we've heard even about the 18th century developments in Siberia and St. Petersburg, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, Karin, please.
Thank you very much for the development, very rich and stimulating. I have a question. Hearing you, hearing the mention of d'Aubigné and that first source for universal history, and I was wondering about the pursuit of peace behind those commitments, those interests in chronology and also in the rhetoric of persuasion of with ekphrasis, and so my question is about the importance perhaps behind all those consideration on peace, the pursuit of peace.
Excellent. That's another excellent question. And I would say very briefly with the time that there is, as you are suggesting now, there is a redemptive aspect of chronology, that when you synchronize things correctly, especially in relation with the Septuagint, you can see this in the debate around whether the Septuagint is the correct chronological template or whether it's not. And so we have to revert to other candidates, or simply follow the Masoretic Hebrew Bible. But you can see that there are aspects of that debate that really have to do with the redemption after the 30 Years' War. I think that's pretty clear. And in fact, it's also related to conversion, because Queen Christina travels in Europe, if I'm not mistaken, because I can't remember everything, but in 1654. And I think that's exactly the time where she decides to abdicate, and she's in Belgium. And that's the time where you have a lot of these actors, which I sort of mentioned, who coalesce in the same time, and they have at least Bochart, Couet, Vossius, Isaac, the son of Gerhard. You have a lot of people reflecting about peace as structuring new kinds of synchronism, parallelism, and bring the idea of purity that is a notion, a philological notion of the Septuagint version, into a more political understanding of that. So I would think that that's a good way to look at it. And about Aubigny, I also, something I would have said if I had more time, but I wanted to be within 35 minutes exactly, is that Aubigny is clearly influenced by two authors. One is Jean Baudin. There's no question about that. The Methodus is the textbook that is really behind a lot of this sort of theory of theorization of history. And the other is the Jesuit Ratio Studiorum. In other words, the idea that intuition of history is also something that, for example, Possevino explains in the Bibliotheca Selecta. And I do think I see in the language of d'Aubigné that you have both of this legacy. One very French, of course, controversial, but Irenic in a certain way. If you think of the colloquium and the way it was read, and indeed by Leibnizians, and Tomasius and others. But you also have the Italian Jesuit Ragione di Stato, which I think is a kind of ingredient to that specific intuition of history, that you can do history in one sweep, putting together the structures of history, and the structures of history have to do with with table making, which I think it's an aspect of the activity of the Italian Jesuits such as Possevino, which is not normally not normally observed, because we think that table making is a Transalpine thing, but it's actually it's also down. Anyway, I tried to.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Other questions or comments? Yes, Lenka?
Well, thank you for your talk. Was great. I'm interested in the theory of metaphors. So I have a question about the eye metaphor. History always has two eyes, chronology and geography. That means all authors use a metaphor of eye and a binocular sense, which is a great example of how metaphor is based in our bodily experience. I sometimes wonder if they use the metaphor of eyes because precisely these two disciplines were perceived as the key tool that all historians have to know, or if they would have named other tools if they were not limited by this metaphor, because metaphor always shaped our thought and so on. So, have you ever encountered some example when the authors use also another tools that they named also other eyes that the historian needs?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's difficult to answer this because I do not know other metaphorization. So you see, the eye of history at the beginning is geography, and then, of course, by early 17th century, you have, as you say, two foci, two locus, no, two types of. But so I don't know other metaphorization that are visual, but the theory is based on Greek text. I mean, not mostly, but primarily. And there is a kind of primacy of that. I mean, the primacy of the eye, I believe it comes from Lucian, from Polybius. Lucian speaks of the mirror as a metaphor in De Conscribenda Historia. And I think the metaphor of the mirror was influential also for cosmographers, certainly. I mean, so the Melancthonian circle, and I'm thinking about in that period, I think they would have been responsive to this because of the Greek sources and also because of Aristotelianism. If I'm not mistaken, Polybius, when he uses the word emphasis, which is really a visual metaphor, if you will, it's about vividness. It's about bringing things before the eyes. Then he uses this from Aristotle because there are parts of the natural researches of Aristotle where he talks about reflecting surfaces and the role of water, the waves, and also the oil, the spills. And in those passages, he seems to be using exactly the same language as Polybius when he defends this kind of theory of history. So this is just speculation, really. But in certain specific places, like the Wittenberg circle, for example, you would have had people who were responsive simultaneously to this kind of theoretical underpinning of visualization of history and also knowing all the primary text. But in any event, I think that we have to deal with the ut pictura poesis. No, I think this is essentially the idea that for a long time, painting is a way to conceptualize writing history. And I think perhaps that in some, well, if you think of the best of our bibliography, for example, the book of Tony Grafton and other things like that, like on the Ars Historia that you can read, I think painting could have a more specific role now, based on the fact that these authors are responding to the problem of how to place the spectator. And I think a lot of the mise en page also reflects this theoretical preoccupation with the empty spaces, blank spaces versus the moment of, for example, Christ, the temporality of Christ, which is announced in certain ways. But there are also other tricks that you see in chronologies where you have a special event that is surrounded editorially by a lot of white spaces, and I think some of that is related to this. The tradition of writing history as painting, which I think is very Greco-Roman, and perhaps could be studied more. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there any other question or comment?
I'm plunging into darkness here, but yes.
All of us.
Yeah.
Uh,
But it was wonderful. Yeah, really. Thank you for the opportunity. It was intimate. I hope you found something interesting. And next time, I believe we have Joanna Lugin. No, if you saw
yes. Next time we have Johanna Lugin with the topic Heavenly Travels from Rome to Brazil, Baroque Imagination and Global Science in Valentin Stanzel's Uranophilus. So this is the second half of the 17th century, I believe, the 1680s. And we are very much looking forward to it. No, thank you so much, Stefano, for your talk today. Thanks to all of you for the questions, for joining us, and I'm looking forward to see you all next week. Okay,
absolutely.
bye-bye.
Bye bye for now. Bye.